Figures of speech are a normal and natural part of our language and bring colour, life and feeling to both our written and spoken language. Yet, if wrongly understood, they can lead to miscommunication and misunderstanding. Being able to recognise a figure of speech and understand how it works is an important part of knowing what it is to interpret scriptures in the same way as any other kind of literature. In his book titled Figures of Speech Used in the Bible, Explained and Illustrated, E.W. Bullinger identifies 217 figures of speech, of which some have 30 or 40 varieties, in about 8,000 instances in Scripture. So you can see this area of figures of speech is a really important one for us to understand, as it's mentioned so often in Scripture, or rather there's so many instances in Scripture. No, don't worry, we're not going to be studying all 217 and the 30 to 40 varieties, or the 8,000 instances, but rather what I want to do is to introduce to you some of the most common figures of speech and how they work. But I do commend Bullinger's book to you. This is a good study companion when you become more familiar with the Bible study process. For some, you may find this lesson a bit technical, but I want to encourage you to be patient. Do your best to identify and understand each of these figures of speech. And as you proceed with your studies, I'm confident that you'll quickly learn how to observe them, interpret them, and they will become familiar to you. The figure of speech is a literary device in which words are used out of their literal sense in order to suggest a picture or an image. Identifying and understanding figures of speech is simply seeking to identify the author's intended meaning, which of course is one of the goals we have. We observe them and then we interpret them. And the goal is to interpret them as the author intended them to be understood. This is all part of inductive Bible study. Just to say that we should note that as we talk about figures of speech, even though we will be talking about individual ones, in reality there's a lot of overlap. Each figure of speech is not some watertight entity in a watertight compartment, but there is an overlap, and for example, metaphor and an analogy are overlap, and you'll see that others do too. So I just mention that there's not a rigid category, but often there's overlap. The first one we're going to look at is an analogy. Analogy. Analogy is where there is a comparison showing points of similarity. Now we're very familiar with this in everyday life. For example, analogy is often made between a heart and a pump, as the heart pumps the blood around the body. In the Bible, we often see an analogy between God, who is the shepherd, Jesus, the good shepherd, and his people that are the sheep. In John 15, the first 9 verses, we have the well-known and powerful analogy of Jesus being the vine and the believers being the branches, and we're called to abide in the vine. This is an example of an analogy that we'll learn to identify. So just to recap, analogy. It is a comparison where it shows points of similarity between two objects to create a picture and to make a point. The next one we want to look at is anthropomorphism. Kind of a long word. Anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is when human form and attributes are assigned to God. We see this a lot in the Old Testament. In Psalm 10 verse 12, God is entreated to lift up his hand. While in Psalm 44:3, we read that the victory is not of human doing, but by the right hand and arm of the Lord. In Psalm 33:18, it is the eyes of the Lord that are on those that fear him. And God is not a God with a physical body. He doesn't have a right hand and eyes. But this is the use of this figure of speech, anthropomorphism. In Genesis 19:29, we read these words which were a comfort to Abraham, that God remembered him. Again, that is a human attribute to remember, because certainly God never forgets, but it communicates something that we can relate to. So, anthropomorphism. It is when human form or attributes are assigned to God. Apostrophe. Apostrophe. Apostrophe is used in the context of a figure of speech. In this context, as a figure of speech, it's not referring to that punctuation mark that is so often forgotten, neglected, misused today, but rather it's a term that refers to addressing some absent or non-existent person or thing, as if present and capable of understanding. It is addressing or speaking to things, abstract ideas, or imaginary objects. Paul Simon, in his song The Sound of Silence, uses this device when he sings,
"Hello darkness, my old friend, I've come to talk with you again."
Hello darkness, my old friend, I've come to talk to you again. Thousands of years before Paul Simon, Moses used this device in his hit song that we read about in Deuteronomy 32 verse 1, where he sings, "Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth." In Psalm 144, we have some humorous and vivid examples of this literary device, where we read that the Red Sea looks and flees, and the mountains skip like rams, and the hills like lambs. In 1 Corinthians 15, at the end of this chapter, the apostle speaks with glorious triumph about the resurrection, and looking death straight in the eye, demands in verse 55, "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" Apostrophe. Apostrophe. Addressing some absent or non-existent person or thing as if present and capable of understanding. The next one is euphemism. Euphemism is from the Greek use of good words. It is when an expression that may offend or suggest something unpleasant is changed to an agreeable or less offensive expression. We're very familiar with this today in our different cultures, where there's a whole variety of words used for the toilet, bathroom, restroom, loo, outhouse. In public life, we have big boned for fat, industrial action for strike, misspoke for lie, and lukewarm, and other such terms for half-hearted. In Genesis 4:1, we read Adam knew his wife Eve, which is an insightful euphemism for having sex. And in Genesis 15:15, Abraham, we read, would go to his fathers, a euphemism for death. In Judges 3:24, we read about King Eglon, this big-boned, or rather fat king. He was said to be covering his feet, a polite way to talk about using the toilet at that time. And Peter in Acts 2:39 declared that the promise was to all who were afar off. In speaking to Jews, he was avoiding the potentially offensive word in this setting of Gentiles. So euphemism. Euphemism is an expression that may offend or suggest something unpleasant to the receiver, is changed to an agreeable or less offensive expression.